At first, everything seemed perfect. I had a beautiful home, a loving husband, and a son who was growing up to be a fine young man. Our family had always been close-knit, or at least I thought we were. We'd always been there for each other, supporting one another through every challenge life threw our way. We went on family trips, shared dinners together, and made memories that I believed would last a lifetime. Every morning we'd all gather around the table for breakfast, talking about our day ahead, joking around, and just enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. It felt like the perfect life, safe, stable, and full of love. But as much as I cherished these moments, something was always lurking beneath the surface. At the time, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there were small signs I ignored. Little things that seemed insignificant but now in hindsight seemed so obvious. My husband, once so attentive and present, had started coming home late from work more often. He'd make excuses about deadlines, meetings, or extra hours he had to put in, but I could tell there was something more to it. His affection toward me seemed to wane, like he was going through the motions rather than genuinely caring. When we did talk, I could feel a distance between us, like we were no longer the same two people who had shared everything. At first, I didn't let myself dwell on it. I had a busy life, and I was content in the rhythm of our family. My son, too, seemed to be thriving. He was growing up so fast, heading into his teenage years, a time when everything starts to shift. He spent hours locked away in his room, as most teens do, but I always assumed it was just part of growing up. We would talk about his schoolwork or the things he was interested in, but there was a quietness to him that I didn't fully understand. He was becoming more independent, as he should be, but it felt like there was a wall between us that hadn't been there before. Looking back, I can see how things were slowly slipping. My husband's late nights became more frequent, and my son's retreat into his room became more pronounced. The family dinner started to feel awkward, like we were all going through the motions, but no one really knew how to talk to each other anymore. Despite all of this, I held on to the belief that things would return to normal. It wasn't uncommon for families to go through rough patches, I told myself. Everything would get back on track eventually. Or so I thought. I never could have imagined what was about to unfold. There were moments when I'd catch my husband acting strangely. He would seem distant, cold, and at times almost detached from the life we had built together. At first, I chalked it up to work stress, or just the pressures of everyday life. We had been through our share of ups and downs, and I believed that this was just another phase. But as time went on, I began to feel a gnawing sense of unease. It wasn't just that he was coming home late more often or that he seemed preoccupied. It was the little things, small changes in his behavior that I couldn't quite explain. His affection toward me had lessened, and the moments of intimacy we once shared had become few and far between. When he did show affection, it felt forced, like he was merely going through the motions. I noticed how he would often leave his phone face down on the table or quickly close it when I walked by. I tried not to overthink it, but there was something unsettling about his newfound secrecy. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than a minor irritation. People have their own personal space, I thought. But the more I observed, the more I couldn't ignore the fact that something was off. I couldn't help but wonder if my husband was hiding something from me. Was it just my imagination, or was he becoming less present in our marriage, less engaged in our family life? It wasn't just my husband who was changing. Our son had started acting differently too. He was spending more time in his room, only emerging for meals or to grab something quickly. He wasn't as talkative as he used to be, and when we did talk, his responses felt robotic, distant. He seemed withdrawn, almost like a stranger living under the same roof. I tried to reach out to him, to have conversations, to understand what was going on in his life, but it was as if a wall had been built between us. He'd brush me off, or give me short answers that didn't satisfy my need for connection. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something happening behind closed doors, something that I wasn't a part of. My husband and son were both slipping away from me in their own ways, and I felt powerless to stop it. I tried to hold on to the belief that this was just a phase, that everything would work itself out. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. Something was wrong, and no matter how much I wanted to deny it, I knew that things weren't as they seemed. One night, after another long day of pretending everything was fine, I fell asleep exhausted, unaware of what was happening around me. I had been burning the candle at both ends, trying to keep up with the demands of work, house chores, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in my family life. That night I had fallen into a deep sleep, too tired to even notice the small noises around me, the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of the television from another room. It wasn't until much later, in the stillness of the night, that I woke up with an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't a nightmare or a bad dream, but an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. My heart started racing, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself, thinking it was just the result of my overactive imagination or the stress of the day, but the feeling lingered. I lay still in bed, straining my ears to listen. The house was quiet, too quiet. That's when I saw him, my son, standing at the foot of my bed. His figure was barely visible in the dim light from the hallway, but I could make out the outline of his silhouette. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, unsure if I was seeing things or if this was real. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, or that I had woken up too suddenly from a dream. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a simple mistake. My mind raced with confusion, and I couldn't comprehend why my son would be standing there, in the dark, in my room while I was sleeping. He didn't say anything, and there was no sign of aggression or hostility. But the mere presence of him in that moment felt completely wrong. My first instinct was to call out to him, to ask what he was doing, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was paralyzed, trapped in a state of disbelief and shock. Why was he here? Why had he come into my room while I was asleep? I wanted to brush it off as just an odd occurrence, something I would laugh about in the morning. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random act, it was part of something bigger, something I couldn't yet understand. What had been going on in my family? What was happening to the bond we once shared? I couldn't even begin to process the emotions I was feeling. All I knew was that something had shifted, and whatever it was not something I was prepared for. In the days that followed, the truth came crashing down, piece by piece. I couldn't shake the image of that night, my son standing at the foot of my bed, his presence so eerie in the stillness of the dark. I kept telling myself that maybe I had imagined it, that it was just a fleeting moment of confusion or a strange dream. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The more I reflected on that moment, the more certain I became that something had gone terribly wrong. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was the beginning of something that had been brewing for a long time. I started to notice things I had missed before. The way my son would avoid my gaze when I asked him simple questions. The way he kept his distance, retreating into his room more and more, shutting himself off from the rest of the family. It wasn't just the typical teenage rebellion I had expected, it was something deeper, something more troubling. I tried to reach out, to talk to him, to figure out what was going on in his life. But every time I tried, I was met with resistance, a coldness that I hadn't seen before. He was pulling away, and I was left in the dark, desperate to understand why. I turned my attention to my husband, hoping that maybe he could shed some light on what was happening, but when I confronted him, he was just as distant, just as vague as ever. He offered no explanations, no reassurances, only excuses. Work was busy, he said. He had a lot on his plate. But I could see through the facade. There was something more, something he wasn't telling me. I pressed him further, but the answers were always the same. There was a wall between us now, and I couldn't break through it. The worst part was the guilt that gnawed at me. I had trusted my family, trusted them completely, and now I was left wondering how I had missed the signs. Had I been too absorbed in my own life to notice the cracks forming in our foundation? Had I ignored the small warning signs, convincing myself everything would work itself out? It was impossible to deny now there was betrayal in the air. My son, who I thought I knew so well, had become a stranger. And my husband, the man I had married, was hiding something from me. Something that I wasn't ready to face. The weight of it all was suffocating. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, unable to move, unable to turn back. The life I had known, the family I had built, was slipping away. The trust I had taken for granted was shattered, and I was left picking up the pieces, not knowing where to start or how to put everything back together. What had happened to us? What had gone so wrong? In the aftermath of the betrayal, nothing felt the same. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air, suffocating everything around me. The once familiar sounds of our home, the laughter, the chatter, the simple comfort of shared moments had all faded into an uncomfortable silence. My son and my husband, the two people I had trusted the most in this world, had both betrayed me in ways I never imagined possible. The distance between us had grown so wide that I couldn't even find the words to bridge it. I confronted my husband, hoping for some kind of explanation, some inkling of truth that would make sense of everything that had happened. But his answers were empty, and the more I asked, the more the facade of our life together crumbled. The lies he told, the evasions, they all added up to one undeniable truth: he had been hiding something far more damaging than I ever realized. His betrayal wasn't just about neglecting our relationship or distancing himself emotionally. It was about the secrets, the hidden parts of his life that I had never been privy to. I had thought we shared everything, but I was wrong. The man I had spent years with wasn't the man I thought he was. I felt like a fool, caught in the web of his lies, trapped in a marriage that had turned into something unrecognizable. And then there was my son. The betrayal I felt from him was different, but just as painful. My heart broke as I realized that the bond we once shared had been shattered. The closeness, the trust, the connection we had, it was all gone. The more I tried to understand what had driven him to act the way he did, the more the answers eluded me. Was it the strain in our family? The emotional distance between my husband and me? Was it something deeper? Something I had missed? I wanted to believe that it wasn't too late to rebuild our relationship, that we could move past this and heal. But every time I reached out to him, he recoiled further into himself. It felt like I was losing him, not just as a son, but as the person I thought I knew so well. He wasn't the same anymore, and neither was I. The guilt was unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed them both. Had I been too wrapped up in my own world to see what was really happening in theirs? Had I neglected the signs, allowed the cracks to grow too wide to repair? I didn't know where to go from here, or how to fix the damage that had been done. The love I had for my family was still there, buried beneath the layers of betrayal and pain. But the trust, the foundation that had held us together, was broken beyond repair. I was left to navigate a life that no longer felt familiar, trying to rebuild my sense of self in a world that had been turned upside down. What had once been a family was now a shell of what it had been, and I was left alone to figure out how to pick up the pieces.